Hello, everybody, and welcome to the third session of our PWL International Seminar. As you know, this seminar is hosted by ifilnova and held once a month in the context of the FCT-funded project Mapping Philosophy as a Way of Life, an Ancient Model, a Contemporary Approach. And today we have the pleasure of having with us not one, but two very dear and special speakers, whom I'm very glad and pleased to introduce to you very shortly. Eli Kramer is an associate professor at the Institute of Philosophy of the University of Wrocław. He specializes in meta-philosophy, in particular philosophy as a way of life, intercultural philosophy, philosophy of culture, German and American idealism, classical American philosophy, and process philosophy. Alongside Matthew Sharp and Michael Chase, he's co-editing the Brill book series, Philosophy as a Way of Life, Texts and Studies. And he has recently, in 2021, published the book Intercultural Modes of Philosophy, Volume 1, Principles to Guide Philosophical Community with Brill. And he has also co-edited and contributed to collections such as Philosophy of Culture as Theory, Method and Way of Life, Contemporary Reflections and Applications from 2022, Horty and Beyond from 2020, and Contemporary Philosophical Proposals for the University toward the Philosophy of Higher Education in 2018. Our second speaker is Dr. Leonard-Waks, who is Professor Emeritus of Educational Leadership at Temple University in the USA, even though he now lives in a wonderful space in Lourinhã, in the outskirts of Lisbon in Portugal. He was Distinguished Professor of Educational Studies at Hangzhou Normal University from 2018 to 2021. Waks is also the author of Education 2.0, The Learning Web Revolution and the Transformation of the School, published in 2013, and The Evolution and Evaluation of Massive Open Online Courses, published by Palgrave in 2016, as well as numerous scholarly articles and book chapters. He is also past president of the John Dewey Society and has been awarded the Dewey Society's Lifetime Achievement Award. And he's finally the founding editor of the journal Dewey Studies. Their talk today focuses precisely on John Dewey and its connection to philosophy as a way of life. The title is Growth Unbound, John Dewey on the Socio-Cultural Role of Philosophy as a Way of Life. We are looking forward to listening to you. So without further ado, I will just give you the words. So please, Eli and Leonard, thank you for being there, and the floor is yours.
We're really excited to be here. And in fact, we had the opportunity to meet together and brainstorm this paper, and really felt like the project helped us uncover aspects of Dewey's meta-philosophy, at least to our knowledge, hasn't been fully explored. So we have a lot of ground to cover. We will do our best, and we will talk about parts that in that exciting project we won't be able to get to today. So I will start, and then I'm going to hand it over to Len a little more than halfway through. So with that said, let me share screen and get us going. All right. So as Marta said, the title of our paper is Growth Unbound, John Dewey on the Social-Cultural Role of Philosophy as a Way of Life. And to start the paper, I'm going to start with a very famous line from John Dewey that I know, given there's some Deweyans in the audience too, will well recognize. Philosophy recovers itself when it ceases to be a device for dealing with the problems of philosophers and becomes a method cultivated by philosophers for dealing with the problems of men, end quote. So, introduction. A common critique of philosophy as a way of life, hereinafter PWL for short, as a historic connected collection of traditions, is that they focus too much on the individual self-cultivation at the expense of social cultural reform. On one hand, it is easy to show that many of these traditions across the globe, and especially the Stoics, Confucians, and some neo-Kantian idealists such as Wilhelm von Humboldt, envisioned and carried out projects of socio-cultural reconstruction as part of their practice. They committed their adherents to lives of service, provided guidance on good government, and shaped generations of educational institutions. On the other hand, we struggle to articulate what the equivalent of the beyond discursive reform of the spiritual exercises of the individual, alone or in their schools and communities, are at this social cultural level. While there is a developing scholarship on the range and scope of spiritual exercises in the history of global philosophy for the purposes of self-cultivation, and in some cases a life of service, it is not clear what it means to coordinate PWL programs of social cultural reform that are not mere discourse on the subject, rather than philosophical efforts to transform society and our relationship with the natural world. So for that reason, in this presentation, we seek to show that the philosopher, public intellectual, and social reformer John Dewey, who lived almost 100 years from 1859 to 1952, has a unique contribution to offer the PWL field. His account and attempts to put into practice a PWL-oriented approach to reconstruct modes in which we associate, so as to ensure we can ever grow and co-develop symbiotically as individuals and communities. When we act with others in community, by virtue of communication and mutual adaptation, our transactions leave both us and those others, and at times the entire community, changed. Dewey argues that without societal cultural reconstruction, PWL projects will not be able to provide the means for ever deeper and richer arts of living. For if PWL spiritual exercises, communities, schools, and institutions become ever more isolated and rarefied, serving largely an elite group increasingly detached from the broad problems of man, their priorities will be ever more insular, and their effectiveness for addressing the problems of life and our given societal situations will become ever weaker. Eventually, they will become the rotten privileges of a class no longer in dialogue with anyone, and not even of service to themselves. PWL will devolve into the very sophistry and professional scholasticism it rejects. On the other end, those increasingly excluded from PWL will suffer from disparagement and disempowerment, easily coerced by sophists and at worst authoritarians. So in order to address such a situation, drawing on the PWL tradition, Dewey launched a series of connected experiments: schools, artistic communities, new republics of letters, and institutions of higher learning, and some others too, that work to coordinate human social relations in such a way to untap and empower flourishing individuals to work collaboratively to achieve common ends. It is such humane educational associations with empowered individuals that he thought were able to create publics that could best address the complex problems of socio-cultural life. In this context, what emerges is that humane associations are the means by which Dewey thought philosophy released the open-ended growth potential of humanity and culture. He provides us the groundwork to talk about the transactional relationship between individual growth through a variety of tools and exercises, and social cultural reconstruction through enriching modes of educational association. So in the first part of the longer paper, which we won't be able to go through, we use the work of Matthew Sharp and Michael Ure to explore the critique of PWL as having too limited an account of socio-cultural reform. Since many of you in this audience were kind of familiar with this framework, and we gave some in the introduction, we'll reserve the longer discussion for the full paper. In the second section of the presentation, we briefly outline how we see pragmatism, and Dewey in particular, as revitalizers of PWL as a distinctive way of doing philosophy. This metaphilosophical orientation emerged from the American appreciation of relationality, isolation, and resistance to European academic philosophy, and a care for the problems of everyday life. We also contend that Dewey and William James were the inheritors of the PWL traditions of antiquity, especially as drawn from the Transcendentalists. Once put in context of the idealistic influences that shaped Dewey, we will be able to understand why he shifted emphasis from modes of spiritual exercises, or as Dewey would have surely preferred, technologies, or what we'll call technologies of growth, for humane associations. We then outline Dewey's account of the emergence and role of philosophy within cultural life. In particular, we emphasize a thread he finds from PWL devoted to developing associational practices that could reform society and culture, but that the full potential of such a mission was eclipsed and remains underdeveloped in the history of philosophy. We will then finally be in a position to lay out, at least hopefully partially today, Dewey's account of how humane educational associations are the means by which philosophy assists social cultural life as a collective and democratic art of living. So, first section, Dewey in the PWL tradition. Those of you who have been following this seminar series will recognize this slide. So in a recent talk for this seminar series, as part of the Mapping Philosophy as a Way of Life seminar, Sharp outlined two approaches to assessing PWL within the history of philosophy. While perhaps both approaches have their place in PWL research, for our purposes today, we will approach Dewey from the lens of the restricted program. From that perspective, it would properly take a monograph to fully flesh out where Dewey stands within it. For the historians of classical American philosophy, it is striking and intuitive to understand many of its figures, and especially classical pragmatism. That is Charles Saunders Peirce, William James, John Dewey, Jane Addams, and Josiah Royce, Elaine Locke, and many others, as committed to PWL. Celebrated American philosophers such as Richard Schusterman, been regularly a part of the seminar, and Hilary Putnam, find Dewey in particular the exemplar of the best of PWL in the American context. And I'm going to skip a little bit of a literature review I do on that subject, which includes some very fascinating people like John Lax, who are attempting what he calls Stoic pragmatism. To properly understand, to properly understand Dewey's conviction here, it is important to have a sense of the very different emergent and trajectory of a classical American philosophy from its European counterparts that shaped his approach to PWL. First and foremost, the American tradition of philosophy owes a great deal to the First Nation indigenous philosophies that have developed alongside and have continued to be in dialogue with and often resistance to European thought and certainly colonization. As Bruce Wilshire and Scott Pratt have both argued in their important respective monographs, and Aaron McKenna and Pratt have well laid out in an introductory primer for students that they published. The same goes for the Africana philosophies that emerged from Black slaves brought to the United States and the philosophies from other immigrant and other marginalized communities. These forces have had deep and fundamental influences on the trajectory of American philosophy's sensitivity toward relationality and dialogical inclusive engagement with both nature and other persons, particularly the oppressed. This relational attitude with nature and others interweaved over time with the formal logics of similitude that the Puritan colonizers brought wisdom through their commitment to the logic of Petrus Ramus as a counter to Aristotelian syllogistic logic they saw as part of heretical Catholic thinking. For those unfamiliar, this logic looks for patterns, types, and signatures of relation and similarity across experience to illuminate broader patterns of reality, as opposed to looking for identity and difference as the key forms of clear thought. As an interesting commonplace with PWL, Foucault devotes a great deal of time to logics of similitude as they develop in the late medieval and Renaissance period, and were radically disrupted by modernity in The Order of Things, and in actually some other works as well. Although the next generation would largely reject Puritanism, this legacy remained, as Steve Daniels, for example, has well demonstrated in Charles Saunders Peirce's philosophy. Kenneth Stickers also points out to the work of Cornel West, who sees the American philosophical tradition as having escaped the epistemologically centered debates of scholastic and then professional philosophy in Europe, and instead getting centered in this thick relational world. As Dewey would note toward the end of his career, quote, I submit that if the influence of traditional epistemology were wholly eliminated, the work of genuine realism would consist in framing a theory of knowledge on the basis not of a relation between subject and object, no matter who either of them is defined or described, but of connections that are found among known events, end quote. Such logic and epistemology, the two are interconnected for Dewey, would seek to explore the infinitely nested relations between events, that is, objects of investigation. Another factor Stickers points to was a certain anti-intellectual, this is a quote, anti-philosophical strain in Puritan thought. Philosophy was long carried on in America, mainly in a variety of venues outside of its institutions of higher learning. Only relatively recently in American history has philosophy become professionalized in a manner that we find in Europe, and against which the pragmatists protested, end quote. Dewey saw this strain in the American experience as both providing much potential for a deeper PWL, as well as significant dangers. As he emphasizes in the need for the recovery of philosophy, which we'll be talking a lot about today, quote, our life has no background of sanctified categories upon which we may fall back. He's speaking about America here. We rely upon precedent as authority only to our own undoing. For with us, there is such a continuously novel situation that final reliance upon precedent entails some class interest guiding us by the nose whither it will, end quote. As we shall see, the promise is in our ability to being able to evade the classed and isolated formalism of much of philosophy, and instead find new ground for collective growth, i.e. eudaimonia as unfixed from final ends. Stickers points to three alternative ways in which PWL was developed in the US context outside of universities, via pamphlets, newspapers, periodicals, and other modes of the Republic of Letters during the Revolutionary period, via the lectures of independent scholars, such as Emerson, who, quote, made their living by giving public lectures, writing articles for popular magazines, and self-publishing their works, end quote, and via alternative philosophical communities, schools, and institutions, quote, both formal and informal, that promoted serious philosophical study and discussion outside of the college system and open to the public, end quote. These would have a lasting legacy on Dewey's vision for how to carry out PWL in the American context. Of particular note here for our purposes is Thomas Davidson, who explicitly aspired to revive fellowships in the spirit of ancient and Hellenistic schools that practice ascesis for mutually reinforced self-cultivation. Dewey famously participated in his summer schools for the cultural sciences, which were both philosophical inquiry and practice were intertwined. In addition, there was the St. Louis Hegelians, a philosophical association, quote, flourishing in the 1860s that was organized around William Torrey Harris. This group was influential in promoting German idealism in America. Harris strongly influenced John Dewey, and its journal, the Journal of Speculative Philosophy, continues today, end quote. By the way, interesting connection for us, Matteo just published a piece on transcendentalism and PWL in that journal. A little bit of promotion. As a young philosopher, Dewey sought the assurance from Harris about his philosophical potential and would publish his first articles in his journal. This philosophical community saw Hegelianism as not merely another scholastic systemization of our metaphysical historical situation, but rather a school in which to practice philosophy as a site for socio-cultural reconstruction. And indeed, they practiced what they preached, launching new schools and educational programming that fundamentally shaped K-20 education in the United States. Harris also worked with Amos Bronson Alcott's Concord School of Philosophy, another early promoter of American PWL, and later moved to Concord to live in the community of transcendentalists that had blossomed there. He served as the superintendent of schools in Concord from 1882 to 1885, a fact largely unknown today in American philosophy circles. He also became the US Commissioner of Education and was the most important educational leader of his lifetime, especially connecting elementary school to the high school through the template of the augmented American Common School, which shapes our system today. The fact that he decided to move to the center of American transcendentalism in Concord speaks volume about the potential he saw for PWL, both through spiritual exercises practiced by the transcendentalists and as a site for socio-cultural reform as he had been practicing it. This leads naturally to the third PWL influence on Dewey, the transcendentalist revival of ancient PWL. As I noted, our colleague Matteo Stetler recently published a piece on it, and Pierre himself also noted this connection, that the transcendentalists explicitly sought to recover the ancient conception of PWL through spiritual exercises, and especially noted that the transcendentalists saw this as something that had been lost in contemporary life. A quote, "Indeed, terms such as the art of living and art of life appear frequently throughout this is Thoreau's corpus," end quote, as they do in Emerson's corpus as well. And the same for Margaret Fuller. So, how did this milieu exactly shape Dewey? To start, quoting Stickers again, as much as Dewey revolted against his New England Puritan background, he seems to have retained, perhaps with the aid of Emerson, much of the ontological aesthetic sensibility underlying it. Moreover, like Emerson, Dewey sought to recover an aesthetic sense of the ordinary as key to the reintegration of philosophy with life. Both sought to make philosophy an aesthetic way of life, end quote. This was coupled with a commitment to drawing on lessons from the new sciences about how the experimental attitude helps us to attend to our situation and deepen our resources to deal with the problems of life, what Dewey would often refer to as a kind of control, albeit one that is aesthetic, holistic, and embodied. Here, Dewey clearly draws on the sort of spiritual exercises, which are all particular instruments or technologies of what he'll call the method of intelligence, that our colleague Simone D'Agostino has pointed to in his own work in Bacon, to attend to experience instead of getting lost in our own fanciful designs, to lead to a renewal of mind through, in Bacon's terms, aids to reflection, or in Dewey's term, the method of intelligence. Finally, Dewey, reflecting on these traditions, developed an account of what he called modern and unmodern forms of philosophy, PWL being found in both camps. The St. Louis Hegelians, Thomas Davidson, and the Transcendentalists suggested to him that spiritual exercises that belong to an elite class become isolated and abstracted from life too, in a similar pattern to scholastic and professional philosophy's discourses. To ameliorate this tendency and the correlated disempowerment of others, PWL needed to create and sustain new modes of human association in schools, artistic organizations, republics of letters, the academy, and in other places. This leads to the next section. Dewey on the origins, role, and purpose of philosophy. So in Unmodern and Modern Philosophy, a late book of his that was in fact only found in the Southern Illinois University Carbondale archives on accident recently, so it's only been published within the last decade. Dewey attempted to further demarcate how the baggage that we took from the scholastic Greco-Christian philosophical tradition, including from spiritual exercise that only select classes, with a few marginal exceptions, used, has hampered Western philosophy's ability to be present, effective, and meaningful in social cultural life. For our purposes, a few threads of this complex and important story will suffice to lay out our point. So like his view of the emergence of schooling as presented in Democracy and Education, Dewey saw the emergence of philosophy as only happening after a society's symbolic network of meaning and practices becomes too complex to hold together through the habits instilled in small communal kinship groups. Quote, when the state of affairs has reached a sufficient degree of stable order in the arts and in social organization, philosophy as attempt at organization of beliefs arose, end quote. Philosophy draws on the new modes of social organization and arts that attempt to address the complex social life that cannot be passed down directly from one generation to the next through direct learning. Philosophy emerges to find a way to synthesize, adjust, and reconstruct a culture to address and develop in new directions from the broad situations in which it finds itself. These moments of complexity appear when a culture finds that due to increasing interchange of ideas, customs, and perspectives, alongside new technologies and resources, ecological challenges, etc., their social cultural situation changes, and their old customs and ways of being no longer afford stable and functional ways of managing their present situation. The task of philosophers is then to help us move beyond what is no longer of service and bring together the best of the past with novel insights and resources for the deepening of humane growth in the present. And here, philosophy's deepening and honing of the method of intelligence, or a particular approach to ways of living, is key. As he puts it, again, in the need for the recovery of philosophy. To catch mind in its connection with the entrance of the novel into the course of the world is to be on the road to see that intelligence is itself the most promising of all novelties. The revelation of the meaning of that transformation of the past into future, which is the reality of every present. To reveal intelligence as the organ for the guidance of this transformation, the sole director of its quality, is to make a declaration of present untold significance for action. To elaborate these convictions of the connection of intelligence with what men undergo because of their doings, and with the emergence and direction of the creative, the novel in the world, is of itself a program which will keep philosophers busy until something more worthwhile is forced upon them. For the elaboration has to be made through application to all the disciplines which have an ultimate connection with human conduct: the logic, ethics, aesthetics, economics, and the procedure of the sciences, formal and natural. End quote. So in that meaty passage, we find that philosophers are vital in the way they exhort us to use our intelligence to find the potential in the present to flourish and grow together. They support the intelligent ways of living that draw on the insights of the past in connection with the imminent possibilities laid in the present for a better future. They are prophets of all that is possible in our present, guiding us how to strike at the keros of the moment with clear vision. And they do so not by merely discussing these changes in discourse, but also by helping catalyze these potentials in the key disciplines of humane association that shape our ways of living, our conduct. As we shall see, this is no mere armchair practice. It involves moving out from the study and the seminar room into active participation with others in humane associations that will collectively do the heavy lifting in social change. Ironically, specialized domains like the sciences that give us insight into experimental adjustment to and control of new contexts are liable to miss the cultural clutter due to their increasingly narrow scopes of speciality. These continually restrictive specialities blind them from relations of our transacting world, relations that may serve our broader purposes. Philosophy thus seeks to serve progressive humane ends by supporting the interaction of our activities so as to deepen the quality of our experiences. It is the task of criticism, of identifying and dropping the baggage that no longer serves our present for our future, while offering new arts of living. As Dewey sees it, philosophical schools have offered tested and refined tools for this work, what I've been calling technologies of growth. At best, they do so without reifying those tools as untouched relics of past idealized custom. Quote, the variety of philosophy which defines knowledge in terms of conclusions reached by the use of operations that prove themselves to be progressively cumulative, confirmed confident by success, including their own continued self-correction, in dealing with the problems of any sort as they actually arise, is not involved in the predicaments called philosophical problems that are inevitable when knowledge is defined in terms of privileged connection with what is called the real. I'm adding quote marks for emphasis here, end quote. So a genuine modern philosophy is distinctive from unmodern philosophy because of its experimental attitude. This helps us inquire into better procedures of responding to and dynamically controlling our environments, instead of becoming merely lost in philosophical navel-gazing. For our non-English speakers, that means too much self-referential looking at your own problems without looking at the broader world. It means looking at your belly button.
I can break in for just a second, Eli. You have these reversed.
Okay, yes, thank you.
Okay.
Sorry. No, dynamically could, yeah, sorry, there was, the second one should be switched, excuse me. Thank you, Len. You're right. The second, yes, I see the issue. So real quick, dogmatic attitude in the unmodern philosophy, philosophical navel-gazing in unmodern philosophy, scholastic professional in unmodern philosophy, and maintained cultural dualism in unmodern philosophy. On the modern philosophy side, experimental attitude, dynamically controlling our environment, transcends academic public, and ameliorates cultural dualisms. Sorry for the confusion, not a very helpful slide, but we will move forward. So actually, I'll keep that up for just a sec, but just remember the shift here. I just accidentally mixed them up when I was making these slides. Guiding philosophy and philosophical navel-gazing. It is important to note here that modern does not refer to a historical period per se, as Dewey defined ancients who were for their time modern philosophers. Although Dewey does see opportunity for deepening the reconstructive power of philosophy by drawing on the experimentalism of the sciences, and especially the development of evolutionary theory since Darwin, these are better progressive developments of the same attitude. This work, especially in its exemplary modern form, is not to be reduced to what is called philosophy by professional academics. While Dewey saw modern philosopher as more of a alluring ideal, one might see here his fellow pragmatists, especially Peirce and William James, as models of what he was after. He saw colleagues such as Bertrand Russell, who espoused liberal values but carried along inflexible shudders to certain aspects of the world as distinctly unmodern philosophers. The problem is the very kind of vocation tasked with this work, philosophy, has its own baggage from high scholasticism and dualisms manifested in class relations between things and persons, mind and body, the practical and theoretical, the material and the ideal, and the natural and nature and humane nature. That in turn, it has spread throughout Western culture. This baggage carries along with it a dogmatic obsession with one side of these dualisms as somehow superior, where certain aspects of experience are selected as the ultimate better part of reality. For example, this is the next quote. Ever since Aristotle began this tendency to improve the inherent superiority of exclusively theoretical action, characteristic, according to him, of the philosophical class over the activity of every other class, including that of the rules of the state, I think it must be admitted that the desire of intellectuals to magnify their office has played subconsciously a role in maintaining the belief that pure intellectual activity, where pure means free from all emotional and practical connection, is a condition both possible and representative of the ultimate ideal. End quote. I'm almost done here, 2 minutes, and I will get to where I want. As previously noted, technologies of growth can fall into bad habits too, where a certain kind of rationality is privileged to the degree of sometimes even ignoring the body, such as the ascetic end of Neoplatonism. For the Greco-Christian tradition, the ideal, the mind, reason, the universal, and the eternal hold this reverence, and everything else becomes less real. For the materialists, only gritty matter is real, with consciousness as epiphenomenal. This obsession with hypothesized aspects of reality is for Dewey malicious cultural clutter that philosophers have carried with them and promoted as essential, rather than recognizing themselves as cultural hoarders who can no longer find their footing in their own homes. And here we begin to see why carrying out spiritual exercises as one's own or in too closed off monastic communities for Dewey will not achieve the ends desired for PWL of cultivating lives in relation to wisdom. For if the philosophical life is merely about, quote, the idea of perfecting an inner personality, then inevitably, as he sees it, it will become distant from addressing the broad problems of our lives and world. It will, whether intended to or not, be used to reinforce class divisions and block the interchange of humanity that provides us novel insight. I'm going to skip this quote where he talks about the Epicureans in this context. And we'll finish up here with this last one. While one hears the echoes of the old Hegelian critique of PWL as historically isolating from unjust conditions, here already put the question by many PWL scholars, the deeper insight is of a different nature. That if the PWL tradition is treated as a set canon, instead of an ongoing reconstructive effort in dialogue with the problems and needs of our social cultural environment, it will inevitably find itself on the road to scholasticism. And here we find a connection well known in current PWL scholarship, that in the turns towards canonized dogma in the late Hellenic period and later in the Neoplatonic tradition, with an emphasis on loyalty to the tradition and defending it through commentary, runs the risk of making philosophy an ever more scholastic and divorced activity from common affairs. To avoid this situation, modern philosophers then, quote, have at least some responsibility for clearing away the elements of confusion and conflict that are a legacy from its past. If modern philosophy is to have a future, it must articulate contemporary problems and catalyze ways of living that serve our present situation. One would expect Dewey then to conclude that modern philosophy, inside or outside of the academy, would have a commitment to engage directly in social action to improve society and break the class dualisms inherited from the ancients and medievals that philosophy helped to maintain up to the present. However, in this quote, you can see he sees a more catalyzing role for this. I will just end with one last thing, and I'm handing it over to Len. The social action needed for reform will take all of society, not just philosophers, so that we can address all dimensions of the problems at hand in a robust way. Philosophy's task is to help the effective connection of forces in society, so this work can be catalyzed. And I'm going to skip this quote where Dewey talks about how he sees this in the Stoic tradition. Last thing, and this, as you can see, is landslides. For this reason, Dewey sees the need for PWL to carry out social cultural reform. It is not just that it is a commitment to humanity, but rather that engaging with the problems of man and making sure we can address them means truly learning about our situation outside of our philosophical bubbles and adjusting, and in fact, learning from such situations the deficiencies in our arts of living. Only then will philosophical filtration over time do its work of opening us up to the possibilities of the present. Now it is Len's turn. I'm passing it on to him.
Okay, thank you very much. There was one slide way back there which packed so much information for what I'm going to say that I don't want to go back to it, but it's a slide about novelty and the past moving into the future through the present. And I'll take it up from there. So in 1915, after Dewey completed the text for Democracy and Education, actually, you can go back, just leave I'll let you know. After he completed the text for Democracy and Education, which he later says was, quote, for many years, that text in which my philosophy, such as it is, was most fully expounded, he wrote to his friend Scudder Cleiss, quote, not till the present year have I felt that things have fairly come together in my own mind so that I could venture on anything systematic. After Democracy and Education was published the following year, when Dewey was 57 years old, the time when many philosophers are thinking about tying up the knots and thinking about moving on, Dewey initiated a methodical process of developing in successive stages a more systematic and comprehensive philosophy. The program he established for this lifelong endeavor appeared in 1917 as The Need for Recovery in Philosophy, the introductory essay in a collection of essays entitled Creative Intelligence. We can move to that slide. Essays in the Pragmatic Attitude. Creative intelligence was a cooperative effort by Dewey and many of his closest co-workers, many going way back to before turn of the century. In The Need for Recovery, Dewey called for a new paradigm for philosophy, a redirection of all of its main subdisciplines. He mentioned, as Eli pointed out, logic, ethics, aesthetics, economics, and the formal philosophy of the formal and natural sciences. And he wants them redirected from problems internal to philosophy to problems facing the human community. In the succeeding essays in this book, his pragmatist co-workers address these very problems, plus psychology and religion. So Addison Moore writes on logic, Harold Chapman Brown on mathematics, George Herbert Mead on scientific method, Boyd Boda on psychology, Henry Walgrove Stewart on economics, James Hayden Tufts on ethics, and Horace Callan on aesthetics and religion. So here we see Dewey's new program. Here it's a collaborative effort where his whole team, so to speak, is working to turn philosophy to these mostly public-facing branches in a way that will then enter into public life. The authors had no intention of creating a collective philosophy, but merely of demonstrating how those with a pragmatic attitude would approach these areas. In the remaining years of his long life, Dewey tackled each one of them himself. The program laid out in Recovery, Need for Recovery, has already been mentioned above by Eli, but it will be helpful for what I set out here in this section to say more about it before turning to Dewey's subsequent philosophical practice. Dewey starts his essay by making a distinction that sounds an awful lot like Thomas Kuhn's between normal and revolutionary science. Intellectual advance, Dewey says, proceeds in two ways. When it is organized around established conceptions, which are expanded, elaborated, and refined, but not seriously revised. And two, when it offers new conceptions requiring qualitative, not merely quantitative change, through alteration, not addition. The latter occurs, that is the revolutionary philosophy, occurs when changes in knowledge and its socio-cultural surround make old patterns feel unreal, while observations and considerations passed over earlier as negligible, we might say the anomalies, now loom up and cry for attention. The older problems have not so much been solved, we've just moved on from them. For Dewey, the new conditions, industrial, political, scientific, of modern life, now call out for a new attitude and approach in philosophy, a quote, willingness to surrender not merely old solutions, but old problems. The educated public wants to know what modifications and abandonments of intellectual inheritance are now required, what the tendencies of modern life when they are translated into general, that is, philosophical ideas. So after review of the pragmatic conception of knowledge as arising from human problems and serving as an instrument for subsequent problem solving, and the pragmatic conception of mind as attentive monitoring of experience in resolving problematic situations, Dewey turns to what becomes the central idea of the need for recovery, the pragmatic conception of intelligence. He says, the function of mind is to project new and more complex ends, to free experience from routine and from caprice. Not the use of thought to accomplish purposes already given, either in the mechanism of the body or that of the existing state of society, but the use of intelligence to liberate and liberalize action. I'll give a kind of example here of what Dewey has in mind. Think about a river and they've been crossing it with a raft. Well, you might imagine somebody saying, I can build a better raft. The intelligence solution is think of something new, something better, maybe a bridge. And the person who thinks about that now expands possibility. get over it quicker, easier, and when the etc. So the key idea is new ends. We're not trying to do the same thing better. We're now moving on to think about new things to do that are suitable to the problems of our time. Here, the key phrase is existing state of society. Dewey does not want to reform the school, the museum and gallery, the church, the economy, the state, the culture of letters, or the practices of scholarship. He wants to take an instrument to them, something like a crowbar, to open up their current hidebound practices and make them into practices of growth unbound. No new curriculum will do for the schools. No new curatorial practices will do that for the museum. No social gospel will do it for the church. We have to instead reimagine our entire institutional life, envision novel and creative new iterations of the institutions we've inherited for education, politics, religion, art, and scholarship in a new experimental spirit, and then evaluate what happens, preserving the best results with the understanding that the job is never complete, that we might have to undergo this again and again. Intelligence, Dewey says, develops within the sphere of action for the sake of possibilities not yet given. When the bridge builder says, whoa, we don't need a raft, we can get over this easier. Possibility not yet given. Thus, intelligence is the opposite of mechanical efficiency. Quote, intelligence as intelligence is inherently forward-looking. Only by ignoring its primary function does it become a mere means for an end already given. That latter is servile, even when the end is labeled moral, religious, or aesthetic. But action directed to ends to which the agent has not previously been attached inevitably carries with it a quickened and enlarged spirit. A pragmatic intelligence is a creative intelligence. Quote, close quote. Because intelligence is concerned with the as yet not realized. Intelligent action is, quote, generous and liberal and free of spirit, close quote. When activities call upon intelligence and individuals rise to the occasion without turning back to comfortable old habits, there is a quickening of attention, a flush of excitement, and appreciation that things are now moving forward toward a new and richly ordered end that we had not previously pursued. We can read here intelligence as Dewey's secular equivalent of the Holy Spirit. You know, not my will, but thine be done. Or get out of the way with my habits and let the new things sweep us along. And we might think of intelligent action for Dewey as the life more abundant. Okay, the role of philosophy and the philosophical life. The role of philosophy in all of its branches is to engender intelligence throughout social life, to break through limiting conventions that have outlived their usefulness, to foster richer, more abundant lives for all of us as we live out our life in community. Philosophy cannot do this on its own. It cannot stamp out convention-bound institutions by itself or solve the problems they cause. It cannot by itself change institutional action, context of action, from constrictive to liberating. But philosophy can play a crucial role, providing vision, imagination, and reflection. Now, apart from reconstructive action, it should go without saying that such provisions, quote, modify nothing and hence resolve nothing. But action not informed by them, unintelligent action, is just more likely to, quote, increase confusion and conflict than to straighten things out. So what philosophy provides at first is a situated conception of intelligence throughout the various institutional situations of society as a guide for cooperative action. At first instance, philosophers provide these conceptions in texts, books, scholarly and popular articles, and speeches. Now, some actors will be drawn to these guides, but philosophers have to also leave their study and go find their audience by interacting directly with other social actors. Dewey famously attended meetings with educational, social, political, economic, religious, art, and culture reformers every weekday night, dialoguing with them and following them into their scenes of action. His journalistic writings, speeches, and activities were so numerous and influential that, as historian Henry Steele Commenter wrote in 1950, liberal-minded Americans did not quite know what to think until Dr. Dewey had spoken. Dewey traveled to Japan in April 1919 and then moved on to China, where he stayed until 1921. During this time, his occasional writings were dedicated to lectures delivered and events encountered while in the Orient. His main book during this period was Reconstruction in Philosophy, a volume based on lectures in Japan, which extended the main themes of recovery, the need for recovery. Reconstruction was dedicated not to the actual reconstruction, but to lay out its method that was then followed up by the reconstructive volumes on ethics, politics, religion, art, logic, and education. In the course of this reconstructive work, he also produced Experience in Nature, his metaphysical study of the generic traits of experience. Now, experience, considered as the complex of acting and undergoing in a concrete situation, was perhaps the key notion in Dewey's philosophical vocabulary through that period. He later said he wished he had called the book Culture in Nature. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move to my slides. So Eli, can I have the next slide? So here is Dewey's project, basically. He's now addressing culture, which he sees as the interacting of all of these fields of activity, like art, religion, and the like. And he develops reflective texts, these big books, but they're intended for response. And then people are drawn to them. He goes out to them, and he does journalism and public philosophy, but he also engages in the associations with all these other actors with a goal of spreading intelligence. That is openness and creativity and novelty and being able to see new ways of living throughout the entirety of society, not just in the intellectual class. Next slide. So here we see Dewey's project spelled out. He has education, art, ethics, religion, politics, and other things. His main books, Democracy and Education, Art as Experience, Human Nature and Conduct, A Common Faith, The Public and Its Problems, and others, as the big books that set out his big program. And then he did endless engagements with other people through the laboratory school, the art guild, National Association for Colored People, the ethical culture movement, and through third parties. Next slide. So let's take a look at how this works out in a single case. Now, Dewey had already addressed education throughout the 1890s and eventually in The School and Society, which lays out his program. I'm not going to have the chance I had hoped to go into that. So 1899, 1938, Experience in Education. There's a large span, but democracy and education is kind of the main thing. But he also created the laboratory school. He thought of new ways of training teachers. He thought of ways of getting teacher training into the university. He founded the Society for Professors of Education as a way of bringing all of the professors of education in the university into this new project. He founded the AFT, the American Federation of Teachers, and was the first card-carrying member in 1916. He also had greatly influenced the Chicago Teachers Union, founded by Margaret Haley in 1902. So endless journal articles, endless journalism about education. All of this working through teachers, through professors, through parents, through schools, working its way down into the public. And his school became the most researched, the most observed school in the United States. So the idea here is working through the institution, new ideas, and then going out of the study, working with people, writing public philosophy, and spreading the idea through the public. Next slide. Here, the same thing, conventional morality and philosophical morality, hidebound, rules and principles that kind of close and restrict. Dewey wants to have a kind of ethics of deliberation where we're always thinking of the new possibility. For example, in race relations, you see a Black person treated unkindly, well, you might think you should do something. Dewey founded the organization to address the problem. I mean, this is typical of new ends, new ways of working, new kinds of associations. He worked with Jane Addams in Hull House, where he was an aggressive, radical addresser of the labor problems in the United States, of working with the immigrant cultures to come in. Again, endless journal articles on these topics, and then spread out to the public. Next slide. Politics. He saw the state, the American Democratic State, as ossified. He reconceived the state now not as a kind of mystical thing, but as a set of agencies for solving problems when people couldn't solve them themselves, or they couldn't get to the people who could address them. So again, what does he do? He writes endless journalism. I mentioned the NAACP. He's a founder of the American Civil Liberties Union, which is a main, for civil rights, civil liberties like free speech and the like. He founded the League for Independent Political Action, which was the organization, the kind of umbrella organization for creating third parties. It dissolved after the New Deal, but it was a big force in creating the awareness that the old Republican politics was bankrupt. Again, journalism, endless journalism, more than 200 articles just in The Nation and the New Republic alone, spreading the word out to public. Next slide. Okay, in religion. Now, Dewey had been a very typical evangelical Christian, very active in Christian life in the University of Michigan, and very active theologian in Christian circles. He dropped all of that when he came to Chicago in 1894. He was already, by the 1890s, talking about the need to reconstruct religion entirely, to find the kind of living spirit of religion in naturalist terms, drop all the supernatural baggage and the like. He writes his main book in 1934. He joins with the ethical culture. His colleague at Columbia was founder of the ethical culture movement. Dewey joined that, sent his kids to the school, wrote journalism about it. Mordecai Kaplan was the head of the Reconstructionist branch of Judaism. He was a Dewey disciple. Dewey worked with him in Reconstructionist Judaism. Again, endless religious journalism and working with the publics. Next slide. Okay, so art. Dewey had been writing about art from 1896 all the way through to the end of his life. In art as experience, he's combating the museum conception of art, looking at those wonderful paintings on the walls. Oh, they're so beautiful. They have formal properties. They're magnificent. He thinks of art as a kind of doing, and undergoing in the way of trying to find a better, richer experience. So art is intelligent action. It's manipulating and making things, carrying them through to the point where they are rich, complex, and new. And Dewey rails against the museums and the commercial art galleries. He joined up with the Barnes Foundation in their educational projects, and he joined the Artists Guild, and he worked with Stuart Davis on the Municipal Art Gallery in New York, which is planned to be a gallery where the artists themselves curated the show so that it wouldn't have intermediaries like all the commercial buyers and the museum owners and the like. And Dewey was appointed in the Art Guild to be the representative to the mayor of New York City, to the administration, to argue for a municipal gallery. So what all of these maps show is that Dewey's project is a project of writing big books, writing littler books, doing journalism, engaging with people on the ground, and then spreading the spirit of the new out to the public. Now, Eli, I think that's about all the time I will have. I had some other things.
You can do a little, we started a little late, so I think if you run 5 over, that's what I was expecting would happen. It's okay, Len. Go ahead and just do a tiny bit more.
Let's see what else I have. Give me the next slide.
Hold on.
Okay, yeah. So just a word about experience. Dewey sees experience not in the way that the rationalists or empiricists saw it, but rather as ordinary action, relationship of events. You do something and something happens. And is it what you wanted to happen? If so, you get a feedback and it changes you, and now you can do something bigger and you have a bigger result. Next slide. But sometimes what happens, you do something, you don't get the result you want. And so a moment of doubt comes up, and your habits have to be reconstructed. So experience is the process of growth. Next slide. And actually, this is okay. Well, I'll try this one. You're doing something. You're doing. You're undergoing. You're doing, undergoing, doing, and eventually you accomplish something. You have you can say, "I did it. What an experience!" So Dewey calls this the consummatory experience, because now you're not doing, you're consuming, and those radically reconstruct your habits. You are kind of up the level. One more slide. Okay, I'm going to skip that. Go on. One more. Again, keep going to the next set. Okay, one more. Okay, one more. Okay, so what happened? No, back here. So the artist is involved in a process of manipulating materials and undergoing until they accomplish something. Now, the audience for art is not just looking at the result, but they're trying to figure out what makes it the way it is. What does it mean? How did somebody make this? And so it's the audience also has an experience and a desire to create. One more slide. And so the artist is sending out intelligence, which is emulated by, shared by audiences who then act, and that expands out so that the whole community is experiencing rich new orders. That's the function of art. So even art is a way of spreading intelligence in the community. And I'll leave it at that.
Great. And I know we covered an enormous territory, especially of this bigger project we have in mind. So I decided to make a few takeaways, especially for good dialogue between the PWLers and the pragmatists in the room, of a kind of few key takeaways. I'm not going to read them because we're just at an hour, in fact, over, because of starting, because we needed introduction. So I will just leave it here for our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eli and Leonard, for such a rich presentation. We have a lot to process and to reflect upon. We have about 25 minutes for discussion. I'd suggest, Eli, that you stop sharing your screen.
Yeah, sure, I can do that.
And
There.
I see that Helder Bellu has already raised his hand, so please.
Thank you very much, Marta. Thank you, Eli, Leonard, for this wonderful presentation. It was very informative, very stimulant. I found particularly interesting the type of challenge that Dewey poses, not only to much of philosophy, but also to how philosophy as a way of life is often conceived. I also find this final part where you, Leonard, talked about habit and growth very interesting, and it's a shame that we didn't have time to develop that more, because I would love to learn more about his conception of action and self-transformation. And I have two questions that are connected with these 2 points I brought out. So the first one concerns the type of challenge that Dewey poses to philosophy, and particularly what you said about Eli, about the continuity between Dewey and ancient philosophy. So if we consider the 4 features you presented in that table that was mixed up of modern philosophy, I can see 2 of them very easily in ancient philosophy, but it's for me very difficult to see 2 others. So I think it's easy to see that ancient philosophers try to dynamically control their environments, and that they have a trans-academic public, but it's more difficult to see how it could be understood as experimental or as ameliorating cultural dualisms. So I have some doubts about how much continuity there is between ancient philosophy and Dewey, and perhaps it is connected with the parts you jump over about Epicureanism and Stoicism. So if you could talk a bit about that, would be great. And the second question concerns this relation between habit and growth. I was thinking during much of the presentation, how would this societal change that philosophy must carry out and the societal concerns that philosophy should have, according to Dewey, connect with the idea of self-transformation that seems to be at the core of Adorno's and Foucault's conception of spiritual exercises and practices of the self. So during much of the presentation, there was so much emphasis on transformation of society, as far as I understood, and very little talk about self-transformation. So I was wondering how self-transformation could fit into this, if what Dewey is criticizing is also the emphasis on self-transformation. There was some references to these on what you, Leonard, said about habit and growth. So that's why I found it very similar, but at the same time, it wasn't enough to clarify for me how both things would connect. So if you could also elaborate a bit at this point, it would be great. Thanks.
Eli, you can start.
Yeah, I want to hand off the Len quickly, but first, let me to redeem my rush slide. I quickly put it in order here for you all. So just to refresh our memory, I'll turn this off in a second about what Helder was talking about. Very short answer here is the experimentalism is for sure in a way, and I would say a new part, though he sees aspects of historical traditions that have insight here. I'll explain that extent. But this is something where I see if there is a spiritual exercise tradition he's drawing on, it's this kind of thing D'Agostino argues for, that in the modern period, there's this idea that method could be transformative of our way of engaging to the world. So we don't get lost in our imaginations and BES and dogma. I think Dewey his experimentalism sits closer, if there is an analogy, the PWL to that kind of PWL. Now, Dewey makes the case that he sees philosophy as an emergent activity that comes when life gets really hard and complex. So he says that, so like what happens in Athens? Well, Athens meets a lot of different cultures. The old conservative educational program is not working very well, and people have proposals about how we can live better. And that's where he sees novelty. It's not always that philosophers are good at articulating that. He says, modern philosophy, really good philosophy, is the kind of thing that attends to that situation. Now, what happens? The Hellenic schools take that and reify it in, I'm speaking in Dewey, not myself here, reify that stuff and make it into eternal, unadjustable, problematic behavior. So that's the closest short version I can give you. Last thing, and then I'm going to hand it to Len, just because there's a quote I couldn't get to about your question about self-cultivation. The short answer is Dewey is pretty critical, because his concern is anytime we're talking about cultivating me without others, it's going to become navel-gazing at some point. He's not saying we can't deepen ourselves. And this is also his experience of kind of classicists and neo-Thomists that dominated his life. So I sometimes think this is a special drab at, great books education that he felt frustrated by. Hold on, let me see if I can find it. This is the Aristotle. Okay, if it were possible to isolate the present from the future, perhaps no better working rule for attaining happiness could be formed. Here he's talking about Epicureanism. I took a little quote. But the quality of selfish engrossment in one's enjoyment, which seems to cling to the doctrine, is a necessary product of the attempt to exclude concern for the future. Doctrine is, this will get you a hint of what he thinks of the problem with self-cultivation by itself in general, ultimately one of seclusion and passivity. It not only admits the enjoyment which comes from the struggle against adverse conditions with effort to achieve the difficult, but it is a doctrine of retreat from the scene of struggle in which the mass of men are perforce engaged. He actually talks positively about Epicureanism in other contexts, but he basically says directly that if we're talking about self-cultivation by itself, we're already talking about this retreat from the world. And for sure, he has this He is a Hegelian of a sort. Some of this critique, but I think it's a little more nuanced than the Hegel point. There's a little more subtlety here than the typical critique. So I'll pass it to Lan to add anything.
Okay, Eli, keep the slides up, and can you
Okay.
bring me to my slide with the lab school with the little.
Yeah. Hold on.
Okay, so next slide. Okay, no, the slide right after the lab school, one before.
This one?
Okay, good. Yes, good. Okay, so to Hell's point, the problem that Dewey sees with the present school is that it has a static view of knowledge, and it has a static view of thinking. That knowledge is somehow like in a box somewhere, and we could hand it over to students, and that thinking is some kind of methodic set of rituals that we can train students to have. And so the school itself is a transformation because it moves beyond this conception of knowledge and this conception of thinking. So what the school, and I'm going to be very quick with these slides, the school doesn't have any classrooms. It starts out on the first floor with activity areas, kitchen, dining room, textile area, and shop, and there's a garden. So the kids come to school and they're immediately doing things, sewing or weaving. The weaving's big, spinning. They go to the kitchen, they cook lunch, and then they serve it to themselves. There's a shop where they build sheds and stuff like that. And then, as Dewey says, they encounter problems. You don't have to build problems into activities. Activities are problematic. So as the kids try to figure out, we're going to make egg sandwiches for lunch. Well, how many eggs? You know, how many kids? How many eggs per kid? And how long do you cook an egg? And at that point, okay, the teacher says, we'll go to the library and find out. Okay, but suppose the kids come back and they go to this up here in the upper upper left-hand corner in the recitation, they talk and they say, we can't find out, it doesn't say. He says, okay, we've got to experiment. So this next slide.
Whoops, hold on. Here we go.
Oh, while we have this slide, I say, notice that the home the kid lives in with its kitchen, its dining room, its living room, its sewing and handicraft in the shop. No,
Hold on. I'll get there. Keep going.
Exactly where you were.
Yeah, there.
There, okay. You notice it's exactly like the school. So the kids come in with the experience at home. When the children play, they imitate their mom in the kitchen. Or they play games serving food in their little tea thing, whatever. When the kids come to school, they're already ready, they're already engaged. There's no gap. They don't have to think, what the heck is going on? All this stuff being thrown at me. Next slide. So they go upstairs to the physical and chemical laboratory, and they boil eggs to see, well, how long does it take to boil an egg? So they're always thinking anew. So the school is a transformation, and the kids are always going through some process of running into obstacles, having to go get information, and in some cases, having to experiment. The art room, Dewey thinks, is the absolute central room in the school. Okay, so that's the answer is, for that part of the question is that the institutions themselves are transformative. Okay, and in the process of working in these institutions, the individuals are transformed. And not only that, but the philosopher himself, just by having to communicate with ordinary people, with artists, with school people, with politicians, is also transformed, becomes a more realistic person, because he has to now rethink his formulations in terms of what's going to cut it with a politician. So in that respect, he's always growing, becoming more and more capable and worldly in his way of relating to people.
Thank you very much. That was very illuminating.
Thank you. Are there other questions from the audience?
I am sure there are. Bartholomew looks like he's getting ready.
If somebody wishes to make a question or comment, Gianfranco. Gianfranco, please.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Lloyd. And the both now, of course, for this presentation. Just one thing concerning this last part, and then you mentioned it. I remained with the idea that a sort of utopian pedagogy, is can be defined through a divine approach, to school or to university system, something so. And I really wanted to understand if something of this utopian pedagogy was realizes in the campuses or in the school for school formation. This was just a question for this last part. One thing more theoretical maybe could be concerned by another question, that is when I mentioned this idea of American philosophy and gave in a slide some characterization opposing an American philosophy to other forms of philosophy, of course different by geographical provenance, etc. It was something that I wanted to focus a bit more now concerning precisely this idea of American philosophy, because I know that a lot, for instance, of continental philosophy is considered by the Anglophone world as literature or something. So now I think to the current French theory or Italian theory that are concerned much more by the departments of literature, of theories of literature and something. So comparative literature, And so really, I want to understand if your idea of American philosophy was compatible or not, with the current systematization, of academic disciplines.
Len, do you want to take one?
You.
Yeah, you do the first one, I'll do the second.
As far as I understood the first question, the thing is, well, look, some things are known, there's a periodic table and stuff like that. Where does that come?
Thank you, Leonard. If you can, thank you.
Yeah. So the answer is, look, the kids go to the, kids, and also older people. In fact, Dewey thought the same thing true in university. You start with activities and, and you go up to the art room, the science room and whatever. But there's three parts. There's the part where the people are involved in the activity. There's the part where the teacher comes in and coaches them, and they go to the library and they discuss the books that are there. But at the end, they wrap it all up. They have a textbook. The textbook contains a lot of useful stuff too. And then what's in the textbook is brought back into the activity areas in a kind of a spiral, so that after they read, say, something about soil science, when they're in the garden, now they can actually garden better. But now new problems come up and they have to have so it just continually goes through a cycle. It's not as though established knowledge is ignored. It's seen as a tool, and it comes in only in the way that allows it to be used.
And just two other thoughts, because I wasn't sure if it was an element on the utopianism side, but I'll just add, there's Dewey's experiments have a tremendous influence on K-12 and education, and to some degree higher education in the United States and globally, especially in Italy, in fact. But it's a very complicated story with a lot of back and forth and frustrations. This was Dewey's project, but as Len already hinted, in politics, many of these spaces, these humane associations, got hit hard by reactionary movements. So it would take another paper to talk about what happened to this attempt that he imagined. And in fact, the John Dewey Society, which we and Sarah Stitzlin, who I think is still here, work for, became out as a kind of response to that situation. very quickly on the American philosophy side, the answer is it's a very big and complicated story. In fact, there are books and books about the relationship here. What can I say briefly? There's a lot more connections even at the 19th, 20th century side, early 20th century and 19th century American philosophy and European continental thought. For example, Nietzsche was a reader of Emerson, especially his essays, which there's a long commentary on, and he saw as correlates to his own thought. Royce, through his students, was deeply influential on phenomenology. William James was working with Wilhelm Wundt. You know, there's a lot of overlap. And then lots of neo-Kantians decided that the pragmatist theory of truth needed to be bashed at a famous conference in the early part of the 20th century. So it's not like there wasn't overlap in discussion. As for the systematicity and connection to continental thought, boy, is it's just complicated. We would have to talk about particular figures. There are people like Larry Hickman who have compared Heidegger and Dewey's views of technology. There's lots of interest in thinking about Foucault and Dewey together. Dewey also is convinced of the use of genealogy when he does his histories. They're always histories of the present. He's always interested in something like Foucault's historical a priori. There's a lot there. And to learn more about Dewey, I'm going to read Sarah's nice helpful thing. The John Dewey Society website is really useful. And remember to join us at our 2024 conference in Portugal.
Yes.
Which I think Barbara Stengel is, so especially for our Portuguese colleagues, that's really worth highlighting. Yeah, I'll end there.
I have another hand up.
Yeah, we have a last question from Lucas Machado.
We got two questions now.
Oh, I think Bartholomew also on of his thing.
I just can't find the hand, so I.
Oh yeah.
Okay, after Lucas then.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll try to make my question as short as possible. Then, first of all, thank you so much, Eli and Leonard, for the wonderful talk. It gave me a whole lot to think about. I would have a lot of things to ask, but I'll focus just on one. I mean, I was wondering, to what extent do you think that, at least in the broad terms and project, one could bring together John Dewey's conception of this of the school with the actual practice of the ancient philosophical schools? Because in a sense, for me, they are much closer than they seem to be at first. And this is also connected to me with what Hadot says about philosophical schools being concerned with spiritual exercises, not only has a way of self-practice, but rather has a way of overcoming the self, of cultivating cosmic consciousness. And this, in many ways, implies living in community and learning with others. And this is true even of Epicureanism. And to some extent, this might be a sort of provocation in a sense, but I would even have the feeling that sometimes those philosophical schools give us a very good example of what creative intelligence could be in a more radical sense, because Leonard gave this example, you know, of, well, if you want to cross the river, you build a raft, but why don't you build something else? Why don't you build a bridge? But the end of this construction is still the same. It seems ancient philosophers are using creative intelligence in a more radical way, in the sense of saying, why do I need to cross the river to begin with? Why shouldn't I stay on this side? Maybe the problem is thinking that you have to cross the river to begin with. So do you think that there might be a closer connection there? I mean, Dewey, of course, did not read Hadot, but if he did, do you think he might draw closer connections to this conception of the philosophical schools with his own conception of school? But thank you.
Glenn, do you want to start this time or should I?
No, I'm handing this one to you.
All right, I'll take the Hadot side and maybe you can take the creative intelligence side. So the short version that makes this hard is Dewey stays away of talking about, I'm going to try to translate across languages here. Me and Len had tons of discussions about this. It's not perfect, but I'll do my best analogy here. he didn't like talking about particular spiritual exercises for the reason he didn't like talking about particular pedagogies or curriculums, or what a particular political party should do, or what a particular art of experience or like a particular artistic practice do. Because he wanted to build this reflective space to think about what that does at its best. This is why he prefers method of intelligence. His fear is that as soon as we pick out X or Y spiritual exercises of a school, the vital spirit is going to atrophy. Maybe not right away, but give it 100 years, and that's going to become a dogma. Wouldn't you rather catalyze in people this mediatory space and let them build their own spiritual exercises?
Yeah.
I can give you a very quick example. He was a big fan. In fact, they had lots of cross-fertilization with a really important Bauhaus artist, Joseph Albert, who ended up teaching at this extremely cool higher education academic institution. Here's part of the reform project called Black Mountain College. And if you can look up Joseph Albers online, he was famous for these color, kind of monochrome layered color pieces. And if you actually pay attention, because he was really influenced by Dewey and they cross-fertilize each other here, there are actually practices you do with students or other people together to attend to the primary quality of present perception. It's meant to be a kind of spiritual exercise for people. And Dewey loved this stuff. He wanted to advocate for it. He just didn't want to pick X or Y ones so that people would mistake the trees for the forest. That was always his concern, that as soon as you name this tree, everyone's going to get attached to that tree. Sometimes I think he can be a little overcautious there, but then again, he looked at part of the people he's talking to here, I'll just end, are a bunch of kind of neoclassicists who are advocating great books programs, who me and Len actually like, but he felt like they were just, and there's truth here, the worst of it was that they just had a loyalty to a particular curriculum that just had to be the perennial truth of what good cultivated life should be. So that was the issue as he saw it. And I think that audience so dominates his thinking here, that's another challenge to the kind of bridge. But Len, any other thoughts?
Yeah, the first thought is about crossing the river. Maybe the food's on the other side of the river. I mean, Dewey is a naturalist. So, he's like Pierce. I mean, he doesn't like unreal questions. Questions arise because you're hungry. So, you're looking over the river and it looks like corn. So you want to go over there. And Dewey is not for novelty for the sake of novelty ever. Novelty is important because things don't work out right. Things you try something, then conditions change, doesn't work anymore. So long as things are rolling smoothly, the way of doing things, it's the done way is fine. It's like you feel it. The situation's just not right. You're not getting food or whatever. And so the need for the novel is there, but then you don't think, well, I'll cross the river. Maybe you can grow food on your side of the river. I mean, maybe it's not food. Maybe you got to do something else. Who knows? Okay, I think, can we get one more question? I mean, Bartholomew wants to get in here.
Yeah, last question by Bartholomew, but
Yeah.
please be brief because we are already running out of time.
Very, very brief. Very, very brief, guys. Thank you so much, Len and Ellie. It was just, I just wanted to, and Len, you know what I'm going to say probably, but I wanted to just bring it up because you mentioned Hegel and you mentioned Nietzsche, but there was no mention of Marx. And it's just interesting, especially this is more for Len, the part on artist experience, which I find fascinating when you talk about, spreading intelligence, or art is intelligent action. And just given that the book was written published in 1934 at least, and as you know, and for those that don't know, it's fascinating that Dewey just shows the kind of expansiveness of the man, that he led the Dewey Commission in defense of Trotsky of all people,
Right.
during the purges, the show trials. So he set up the Dewey Commission at the middle when Trotsky was probably one of the most outlawed people in the world, who had no visa for anywhere, and Dewey had the wisdom and the courage to take on this commission, and it more or less said that Trotsky was innocent of all the charges that Stalin was putting at him during the show trials, where thousands upon thousands of people were being killed during the show trial. So I'm connecting that because Trotsky, and of course people wouldn't connect in many times, but Trotsky talked a lot about that as art is intelligent action, and the idea of spreading intelligence through art. And of course he does that. He kind of makes that his own kind of thing. He does that from 1920s, 1924. He writes literature and Marxism, and of course Marx already said that, you know, that philosophy becomes worldly and the world becomes philosophy. And we know about, and it's interesting that you really see the real when we really had democracy back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s. That was the real democracy. We don't have real democracy as much as we did. And I think Dewey's a very great exponent of that. So it's just a comment really, and also just to say, when you said at the final point, I'll say, when you said that he was so against the museums, does he mean really that we should get rid of museums altogether, or it's just to kind of keep us going, make art really experimental and transformative? And that's my link to both someone like Marx and Trotsky, who as far as I can see, a lot of the time they're trying to get there in at least when they're talking about that kind of thing, if we were to extricate them from the political revolution. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Well, let me, I know we're running out of time, so let me be very swift. First of all, Dewey visited the Soviet Union in 1929. He thought it was great. Soviet Union, you know, then the Stalin purges and a kind of dogmatism set in. He thought it wasn't great, and then Dewey was, you know, persona non grata, and all the people following Dewey in Russia were sent to the Gulag and murdered. Dewey was worked in the teachers' union, the Trotskyite, Lovestonite faction in the teachers' union. And there was also a Stalinist faction in the New York Teachers Union. And of course, John Dewey was appointed that chairman of the committee to investigate all of the stuff in the Teachers Union in 1935. And he reported, in fact, that they had a very, very serious problem because they had dogmatic authoritarians in the Teachers Union, and they had no way of extracting them from the union. So Dewey's connection with Marxism and communism, it's a fascinating subject. It's also true in China. So he was very sympathetic to many tendencies in Marx. He's also a kind of materialist, you know, in terms of what's driving culture. But the problem is it ossified. It became a dogma, and then it became an authoritarian dogma. And when it became an authoritarian dogma, it was the exact opposite of creative intelligence. In fact, all the creative intelligent people got murdered. So that was, I mean, that's basically how it ended up.
Last thing, a recommendation for more of the connection. Early Cornell West was really interested in the overlaps between some dimensions of Marxist thought, and particularly Dewey, especially Gramsci and Dewey. And as for the museum, he says at the beginning of Art of Experience, you know, that it's essentially blood money from civilization. You know, he is pretty critical. He says this is cultural clutter, it's reified objects. It is the reification of the very dualisms I think we need to overcome. So maybe there's an alternative,
well,
but in fact, he tried to build them.
Yeah, the alternative is the municipal gallery and the art guilds, where the artists and their publics are relating directly without all of this institutional curating and the like. So you know, it's not the museum as a building. Well, a building is, you know, kind of a mausoleum, but it's the fact that people are in the way. And the artists are responding to the curators and the buyers, not to their own feelings and the needs of their publics.
Well, you'll be happy. Curiously enough, last week I was in Berlin and quite far east, and there was a very rundown old bookshop of kind of mostly anarchy books. And in the middle of the books, I picked up this. It was there.
Oh, there it is. With that lovely cover. In this old bookshop selling books of anarchy. So there you go. It's funny that you can see, you know, Dewey in these kind of places. So I'm ready to start reading it now.
Dewey was an anarchist. I think there's no real question. I mean, he thought of himself as a democratic socialist, but there's no question that his sympathies for syndicalism run very deep.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm sure we could go on discussing for another hour or two. I think the discussion even goes on in the chat, which is an excellent sign. But since we are already over time, I need to close this session. I want to thank once again Eli-Kramer and Leonard-Waks for this beautiful presentation, and also all the ones who have attended the session and contributed for the discussion. Many, many thanks. Our last session this academic year will take place on the 14th of June, same time, 4 p.m. Lisbon time. And our speaker then will be Lucas Nascimento Machado from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. I'm already looking forward to it. You will receive the usual reminders. So if not earlier, we will meet each other again then. Thank you once again and see you next time.
Thank you, Len and Ellie.
Ciao, ciao. Thank you.